The wind screamed across the Montana territory like a dying thing, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter that would claim its share of lives before spring returned. Sarah Flores pressed her face against the frosted window of the general store, watching the last stagecoach of the season disappear into the white void beyond the town limits. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-cheeked and desperate, the kind of desperation that made women do unthinkable things. "You sure about this, Sarah?" Cheryl Rodriguez asked from behind the counter, her voice barely audible above the howling gale. "David James ain't like other men. There's stories about him." Sarah turned from the window, her fingers trembling as she clutched the worn advertisement she'd torn from the newspaper weeks ago. Mail-order bride wanted for established rancher. Must be hardy, willing worker. Previous applicants need not inquire. The words had haunted her dreams and filled her waking hours with equal measures of hope and terror. "What kind of stories?" Sarah's voice cracked like thin ice. Cheryl's weathered hands paused in their sorting of medicinal herbs. She'd been the town's unofficial keeper of secrets for 30 years, and the weight of what she knew pressed down on her shoulders like stones. 3 wives he's had, 3 winters. None of them made it to see the spring thaw. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as the snow clouds gathering outside. Sarah's stomach clenched with hunger, a familiar companion these past months, since the factory closed and left half the town without work. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 4 days, surviving on scraps in the charity of neighbors who had little enough to spare themselves. "Maybe they just couldn't handle the isolation," Sarah whispered, though she didn't believe her own words. "Maybe they went back east." "Maybe," Cheryl's tone suggested otherwise. But Mary Patterson was tough as nails, survived the crossing from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on her back. And Elena Vasquez grew up on a ranch in Texas, knew cattle and horses better than most men. If anyone could have made it through a Montana winter, it would have been one of them. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her circumstances pressing down like a physical force. The boarding house had given her until tomorrow to pay her rent or find herself on the street. Winter was already showing its teeth. And a woman alone in this territory had few options, none of them pleasant. The advertisement crinkled in her grip. "I have to try," she said finally. "What choice do I have? Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments." Cheryl studied Sarah's face, seeing the determination beneath the desperation. She'd watched this young woman struggle for months, watched her sell everything she owned piece by piece just to keep body and soul together. There was something different about Sarah Flores, something that reminded Cheryl of her own grandmother, a woman who had walked across half of Mexico with 3 children and arrived in Texas with nothing but an iron will and an appetite that could never quite be satisfied. "If you're set on this fool's errand," Cheryl said slowly, "then you best know what you are walking into. David James owns the largest spread in the territory, but it's 40 miles from town, up in the high country where the snow falls early and stays late. He's been alone up there for near 2 years now, since the last wife disappeared." Disappeared. That's what he told the sheriff. Said she took sick with fever and died in her sleep. Buried her himself before the ground froze too hard. Cheryl's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But John Carter was up that way hunting elk last spring. Said he found women's clothes scattered in the woods, torn up like something wild had gotten to them." Sarah's blood ran cold, but hunger was a powerful motivator, stronger than fear. She thought of her empty stomach, of the landlord's threats, of the winter closing in like a trap. Maybe John Carter was mistaken. Maybe it was just old rags, or clothes that blew off a line. Maybe. Cheryl reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Take this, it's wolfsbane and sage, blessed by Father Miguel before he moved on to the next parish. Keep it with you always, and if things go wrong up there, if you find yourself in danger, you get yourself to town however you can. Don't worry about the cold or the distance. Just run." Sarah took the pouch, feeling the dried herbs crackle beneath the leather. The weight of it was reassuring, though she couldn't say why. "You really think he's dangerous?" "I think he's a man who's buried 3 wives and still advertises for more. That tells me something about his character, and none of it good. Cheryl moved to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. But I also think you're tougher than you know, Sarah Flores. Your grandmother didn't raise a quitter. The mention of her grandmother sent a pang through Sarah's chest. Abuela had been dead 5 years now, but her voice still echoed in Sarah's memory, speaking in rapid Spanish about the importance of never showing weakness, of eating everything put before you, of surviving no matter what the quantum. Mija, she used to say, a woman who can eat anything can survive anything. The stagecoach station was nearly empty when Sarah arrived the next morning, her few possessions packed into a single carpet bag that had seen better days. The driver, George Alvarez, looked at her with undisguised concern when she handed him the fare and told him her destination. You sure about this, miss? Weather's turning bad, and that's a long way to go for someone who might not be expecting you. He's expecting me. Sarah clutched the telegram she'd sent 3 days ago. David James's terse reply was still crisp in her memory. Will arrive Tuesday. Be ready. Not exactly romantic, but it was confirmation enough. George shrugged and helped her into the coach. Your funeral, I suppose, though I hope not literally. The journey into the high country was a nightmare of jolting wheels and biting cold. The coach climbed steadily through forests of pine and aspen, the trees growing thicker and more ominous as they left civilization behind. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape change from rolling hills to steep ravines, from farmland to wilderness. The snow fell harder with each mile, until the world outside became a white blur punctuated by the dark silhouettes of trees. How much further? She called to George after what felt like hours. Another 10 miles or so. Road gets rough from here on. His voice was nearly lost in the wind. Hope you got a strong stomach, miss. This next bit's gonna test it. The coach lurched violently as they hit a series of ruts, throwing Sarah against the side hard enough to bruise her ribs. She gritted her teeth and held on, thinking of her grandmother's stories about the journey north from Mexico. Abuela had walked through desert and mountains, had given birth to Sarah's mother in a cave during a thunderstorm, had eaten cactus and lizards and anything else she could find to stay alive. If she could survive that, Sarah could survive a rough coach ride. The James Ranch appeared suddenly through the swirling snow, a cluster of dark buildings huddled against the mountainside like animals seeking shelter. The main house was larger than Sarah had expected, built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcoming sign in the gathering dusk. George pulled the coach to a stop in front of the house and climbed down to retrieve Sarah's bag. You sure about this, miss? I could turn around right now, take you back to town. No charge. Sarah looked up at the house, noting the dark windows and the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. For a moment, her resolve wavered. Then her stomach cramped with hunger, reminding her why she was here. I'm sure. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing a tall man silhouetted against the warm glow from inside. David James was not what she had expected. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 35, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were well-made but practical, the attire of a man who worked with his hands, but had money enough to dress well. Sarah Flores, he said, his voice deep and carefully controlled. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, I got your telegram. He stepped aside to let her enter, and she caught her first glimpse of the interior. The house was warm and well-appointed, with furniture that spoke of wealth and taste. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, and the smell of cooking meat made her mouth water involuntarily. George, David called to the driver, who was already climbing back onto his seat. Storm's getting worse. You best stay the night. Appreciate the offer, but I know these roads. I'll make it back before the worst hits. George touched his hat to Sarah. Good luck, miss. Hope everything works out for you. The sound of the departing coach faded quickly, swallowed by the wind and snow. Sarah found herself alone with her new husband-to-be, acutely aware of how isolated they were, how far from help or civilization. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. You're smaller than I expected, David said finally, his gaze traveling over her thin frame, and hungrier from the look of you. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. She was painfully aware of how she must appear to him, all sharp angles and hollow places where a woman should have curves. I've had some hard times lately, but I'm a good worker, and I don't eat much. Something flickered in his dark eyes, an expression she couldn't quite read. We'll see about that. Come, you must be cold and tired. There's food ready. He led her into a dining room dominated by a long wooden table set for two. The sight of the meal laid out before her nearly brought tears to her eyes. Roasted beef, potatoes with butter, fresh bread, vegetables she hadn't seen in months. Her stomach clenched painfully, and she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from swaying. Sit, David commanded, pulling out a chair for her. Eat. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She fell upon the food with an enthusiasm that might have embarrassed her under other circumstances, but hunger had stripped away her pretenses. She ate quickly, efficiently, the way her grandmother had taught her during the lean times. Never waste food, never leave anything on your plate, never know when the next meal might come. David watched her eat with an intensity that made her skin crawl, but she was too focused on the food to pay him much attention. The beef was perfectly cooked, tender and flavorful. The potatoes were creamy with butter and salt. The bread was still warm from the oven. She cleaned her plate and looked longingly at the serving dishes. More? David asked, his voice neutral. Sarah hesitated. It wasn't proper for a lady to show such appetite, especially not on her first night in a man's house. But proper ladies didn't find themselves 40 miles from civilization with a stranger who might be a murderer. Proper ladies had the luxury of delicate appetites. Yes, please, she said quietly. He served her again, generous portions that would have fed two people. She ate it all, and when he offered more, she accepted again and again. Each bite seemed to awaken a deeper hunger, as if her body was trying to store up for the lean times it sensed were coming. Impressive, David murmured, when she finally sat back, having consumed enough food for 3 grown men. Most women pick at their food like birds, claim they're not hungry even when they're wasting away. I don't like to waste food, Sarah said, defensive. My grandmother always said it was a sin to leave food on your plate when others were going without. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unreadable eyes. Tell me about her. Sarah found herself talking about Abuela, about the stories of survival and strength that had shaped her childhood. She told him about the journey north, about the times when there was nothing to eat but what could be foraged or caught, about the iron will that had kept her grandmother only through hardships that would have broken lesser women. She used to say that a woman who could eat anything could survive anything, Sarah finished, suddenly aware that she'd been talking for nearly an hour. I suppose that sounds foolish to you. Not foolish at all, David's voice was thoughtful. Survival is about adapting, about taking what's offered and making the most of it. Your grandmother understood that. He rose from the table and moved to the window, peering out at the storm that raged beyond the glass. The wind had picked up, howling like a living thing, and the snow was falling so thickly that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Storm's getting worse, he said, his back still to her. We'll be snowed in for days, maybe weeks. The words sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the cold outside. She was trapped here with this man, this stranger who might have killed 3 women. The nearest neighbor was miles away, the nearest town even further. If something happened to her, no one would know until spring. I should show you to your room, David continued, turning back to face her. You'll want to rest. Tomorrow we'll discuss the arrangement in more detail. He led her up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The hallway was lined with doors, most of them closed. He stopped at one near the end and pushed it open, revealing a small but comfortable room with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the snow-covered landscape. This will be yours, he said, setting her carpet bag on the bed. The washroom is at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at dawn. He turned to go, then paused in the doorway. Sarah. Yes? Lock your door tonight. The words hung in the air like a threat, or perhaps a warning. Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding. Lock her door against what? Against him? Against something else? She closed the door and turned the key, the click of the lock unnaturally loud in the silence. Then she moved to the window and peered out into the storm. The snow was falling so heavily now that it seemed to muffle all sound, creating a white cocoon around the house. She was truly alone here, cut off from the world, dependent on the mercy of a man she didn't know and wasn't sure she could trust. But as she prepared for bed, changing into her thin nightgown and brushing out her long dark hair, she couldn't shake the memory of that magnificent meal. Her stomach was fuller than it had been in months, her body warm and satisfied in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. Whatever David James's secrets, whatever had happened to his previous wives, he had fed her well. And for a woman who had known real hunger, that counted for something. She lay in bed listening to the storm rage outside and the house settle around her. Somewhere in the walls, something creaked and groaned. The wind found gaps in the siding and whistled through them like a mournful song. But gradually, warmed by food and shelter, she began to drift toward sleep. It was then that she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. Footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Slow, deliberate, stopping right outside her room. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock. Once, twice, then silence. Sarah lay rigid in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Finally, she heard the footsteps retreat, fading back down the hallway. But sleep was impossible now. She stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man tested a woman's door in the middle of the night, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't taken his advice about the lock. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm still raging outside with undiminished fury. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, following the smell of cooking food. She found David in the kitchen, standing over a massive cast-iron stove where bacon sizzled in one pan and eggs cooked in another. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Well enough." She didn't mention the footsteps, the tested doorknob. Something told her it would be wiser to keep that knowledge to herself for now. He served her breakfast, another generous meal that she attacked with the same enthusiasm as the night before. Bacon, eggs, fried potatoes, thick slices of bread with butter and jam. She ate everything he put before her and looked hopefully for more. "Hungry again, I see," he observed, refilling her plate without being asked. "Good. I like a woman with a healthy appetite." There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl, but the food was too good to refuse. She ate until she was uncomfortably full, then sat back with a sigh of satisfaction. "Now then," David said, settling into the chair across from her, "let's discuss terms." The conversation that followed was businesslike, almost cold. He outlined his expectations. She would keep house, cook meals, tend the garden when spring came. In return, she would have food, shelter, clothing, and protection. Marriage would come later, after they'd had time to see if they suited each other. "And if we don't suit?" Sarah asked, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Then we'll deal with that when the time comes." It wasn't exactly reassuring, but what choice did she have? The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even if it did, she had nowhere else to go. She was committed now, for better or worse. The days that followed fell into a strange routine. David would disappear for hours at a time, tending to his cattle or checking the outbuildings, leaving her alone in the house. She cleaned and cooked and tried not to think about the locked doors she'd found on the second floor, or the way David watched her eat with that strange intensity, or the fact that she was consuming enough food each day to feed a family of 4. Her appetite had become truly extraordinary. She would wake each morning ravenous, as if she hadn't eaten in days. David seemed to take pleasure in feeding her, preparing elaborate meals that she devoured with increasing enthusiasm. She was gaining weight rapidly, her hollow cheeks filling out, her thin frame becoming more substantial. But instead of feeling satisfied, she only grew hungrier. It was on the 5th day that she made the discovery that changed everything. David had gone out to check on the cattle, leaving her alone in the house. Restless and curious, she decided to explore the rooms she hadn't seen yet. Most of the doors on the second floor were locked, but one at the very end of the hall stood slightly ajar. Inside, she found what had once been a woman's room. The furniture was covered with dust sheets, but she could see the feminine touches underneath. a delicate vanity table, a wardrobe full of dresses in various sizes, a jewelry box with a few forgotten trinkets. On the bedside table sat a small daguerreotype in a silver frame. Sarah picked up the photograph and studied the woman's face. She was young and pretty, with dark hair and serious eyes. At the bottom of the frame, someone had engraved a name, Mary Patterson, beloved wife. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. This had been the room of David's first wife, the woman who had supposedly died of fever. But if she was dead, why did David keep her room like a shrine? And why were there 3 different sizes of dresses in the wardrobe, as if the woman had been rapidly gaining weight? She was so absorbed in her discovery that she didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs, didn't realize David had returned until his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I see you found Mary's room." Sarah spun around, the photograph clutching in her hands. David stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and his dark eyes glittered with something that might have been madness. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered. "The door was open and I was curious. I didn't mean to pry." Curious. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "That's what killed the cat, isn't it? Curiosity." The sound of the lock engaging was like a death knell in the silence. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as David stepped closer, his boots silent on the dusty floorboards. The photograph trembled in her hands, Mary Patterson's serious eyes seeming to watch from beyond death itself. The locked door behind David might as well have been the entrance to a tomb. "She was beautiful," David said, his voice soft and dangerous. "Mary, she had the most delicate appetite when she first arrived. Could barely finish a bowl of soup," his dark eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "But that changed quickly enough." "What happened to her?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. David moved to the wardrobe and pulled open the doors, revealing the dresses Sarah had noticed earlier. They hung like ghosts in the dim light, progressing from small to medium to large, the fabric of the largest one straining at the seams as if it had been worn by someone whose body had expanded beyond its capacity. "Mary had such a small appetite at first," David continued, running his fingers along the fabric of the smallest dress. "Said she wasn't used to rich food, that her stomach couldn't handle much. But I convinced her to eat more, told her she needed to put on weight for the winter, that the cold would kill anyone too thin to survive it." Sarah's mouth went dry. She thought of her own expanding appetite, the way she'd been consuming enormous meals without question, driven by a hunger that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "She started eating more," David said, moving to the medium-sized dress. "And more. Said she couldn't help herself, that the food tasted too good to stop. I was so pleased. I thought I'd finally found a woman who appreciated what I could provide." He reached the largest dress, his hand lingering on the stretched fabric. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The hunger had taken hold of her completely. She couldn't stop eating, couldn't control herself. She would wake in the night and go to the kitchen, consuming everything she could find. Sarah's stomach lurched, not with hunger for once, but with a sick realization. "You did something to the food." "Not something harmful," David said quickly, turning to face her. "Just something to help her appetite along, to make her appreciate the abundance I could offer. I thought if I could make her truly hungry, truly grateful for what I provided, she would never want to leave." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. She thought of every meal she'd consumed since arriving, the way the food had tasted better than anything she'd ever eaten, the way her appetite had grown instead of being satisfied. "You've been drugging me." "Helping you," David corrected. "You arrived half-starved, desperate. I gave you what you needed most, an appreciation for sustenance, for security. Look at yourself, Sarah. You are healthier now than when you arrived. Stronger." Sarah caught sight of herself in the dusty mirror above the vanity. He was right. Her face had filled out, her hollow cheeks now rounded, her thin frame beginning to show curves where there had been only sharp angles before. But the woman looking back at her had wild, desperate eyes, the eyes of someone who had lost control of her own body. "What happened to Mary?" she asked again, though part of her already knew. David's face darkened. "She couldn't handle the gift I gave of her. Instead of being grateful, she became frightened, started refusing to eat, trying to starve herself back to her original size. But the hunger was too strong by then. She would sneak food in the night, gorge herself until she was sick, then hate herself come morning. He moved closer to Sarah, and she pressed herself against the wall, the photograph still clutched in her trembling hands. She tried to leave one night during a storm, said she'd rather die in the cold than become a monster. I tried to stop her, tried to make her understand that she was perfect the way she was becoming. But she fought me, ran out into the blizzard in nothing but her nightgown. You let her go? I followed her, of course. Found her collapsed in the snow about a mile from the house. The cold had already taken her by then. His voice carried what might have been genuine sorrow. I buried her when the ground thawed in spring. Kept her room exactly as she left it, as a reminder. Sarah's mind raced. The story sounded plausible enough, but something didn't ring true. What about Elena Vasquez and the third wife? David's expression hardened. Elena was different, stronger. She lasted almost 2 full winters before the hunger drove her to madness. Found her in the kitchen one morning, covered in blood, having tried to eat raw meat with her bare hands. The wildness had taken her completely. The image was horrifying, but Sarah forced herself to keep listening. She needed to understand what she was facing. And the third? Rebecca Chen. She only lasted 3 months. Threw herself from the second-floor window rather than continue living with the hunger. David shook his head sadly. I thought I had learned from my mistakes by then, had perfected the process, but she was too weak, too fragile for what I was offering. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. 3 women, all dead, all victims of whatever David had been doing to them, and now it was happening to her. You're insane. I'm lonely, David said simply. Do you have any idea what it's like to live in isolation for months at a time, with no one to share your meals, your home, your bed? I built this place to be a paradise, stocked it with everything a woman could want. All I asked in return was appreciation, gratitude, and companionship. By drugging them, by making them lose control of their own bodies, by helping them understand abundance, David insisted. You were starving when you arrived, Sarah, literally wasting away. I gave you the gift of appetite, of satisfaction, of never having to worry about hunger again. Most women would be grateful. Sarah thought of her grandmother's words about survival, about eating anything to stay alive. But this wasn't survival. This was something else entirely, something twisted and wrong. Let me go. Where would you go? It's the middle of winter, 40 miles to town, and the storm's been raging for days. You wouldn't make it a mile. David stepped closer, his voice becoming gentle, almost hypnotic. Stay, Sarah. Let me take care of you. Let me feed you and keep you warm and safe. All I ask is that you appreciate what I provide. The way Mary appreciated it, the way Elena did. They fought against their nature, David said. They tried to deny the hunger instead of embracing it. You're different, Sarah. I can see it in the way you eat, the way you savor every bite. You understand what I'm offering. Sarah's mind raced, looking for an escape, a way out of this nightmare. But David was right about one thing. She was trapped here by the storm, by the isolation, by her own circumstances. Even if she could somehow get away from the house, she would never survive the journey to town in this weather. I need time to think, she said finally. David studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Of course, this is a lot to understand all at once, but Sarah? He reached out and touched her cheek with surprising gentleness. Don't try to fight the hunger. It's part of you now, and fighting it will only make you miserable. Embrace it. Let it make you strong. He unlocked the door and left her alone in the Mary's room. Sarah sank onto the dusty bed, her mind reeling. She thought of the past few days, the way she'd consumed enormous meals without question, the way her body had changed so rapidly. How long did she have before the hunger became uncontrollable? How long before she ended up like Mary, fleeing into a blizzard, or like Elena, driven to madness? She had to find a way out of this, but first she needed to understand exactly what David had been doing to her. The kitchen would have answers. Whatever he was using to enhance her appetite would be there, mixed in with the food or the cooking supplies. Sarah waited until she heard David's footsteps fade down the hallway, then crept out of Mary's room and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet except for the howling wind outside and the occasional creak of settling wood. She found the kitchen empty, the remains of their breakfast still sitting on the table. She began searching methodically, opening cabinets and drawers, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Most of the ingredients were standard: flour, sugar, salt, various spices and seasonings. But in a locked-in cabinet near the stove, she found something that made her blood run cold: a collection of small glass vials, each labeled in David's careful handwriting: appetite enhancement, Mary P; hunger stimulant, Elena V; digestive accelerant, Rebecca C. And at the end of the row, a fresh vial labeled metabolic catalyst, Sarah F. She pulled out her own vial and held it up to the light. The liquid inside was clear and odorless, but somehow it seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. This was what he'd been putting in her food, what had been driving her uncontrollable hunger and rapid weight gain. Footsteps on the stairs made her freeze. David was coming back down. Quickly, she pocketed the vial and closed the cabinet, then grabbed a cloth and began wiping down the already clean counter, trying to look busy. "Feeling restless?" David asked as he entered the kitchen. "Just thought I'd clean up from breakfast," Sarah said, not trusting herself to look at him directly. "No need, I'll take care of it." He moved to the stove and began preparing what looked like another elaborate meal. "You must be getting hungry again. It's been several hours since you ate." As if summoned by his words, Sarah's stomach cramped with sudden, overwhelming hunger. The sensation was so intense it nearly doubled her over. She gripped the edge of the counter, fighting against the desperate need to consume everything in sight. "I see it's starting to work faster now," David observed with satisfaction. "The hunger becomes stronger each day, more insistent. Soon you won't be able to think of anything else." Sarah forced herself to straighten up, to meet his eyes. "What if I refuse to eat?" "You can't," David said simply. "The compound I've been giving you has altered your metabolism, your brain chemistry. Your body now requires constant intake to function. If you try to starve yourself, you'll experience withdrawal symptoms that will make you wish you were dead. Hallucinations, seizures, organ failure." Mary tried it for 3 days before she gave in. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She was trapped, not just by the storm and the isolation, but by her own body's betrayal. "You're a monster." "I'm a man who knows what he wants and takes steps to get it," David corrected. "I want a companion, someone who will appreciate the life I can provide. The hunger ensures that you'll never take my generosity for granted, never want to leave the abundance I offer." He continued cooking, the smell of searing meat filling the air and making Sarah's mouth water despite her revulsion. Her stomach cramped again, more violently this time, and she had to grip the counter to keep from falling. "Fighting it only makes it worse," David said without turning around. "The sooner you accept your new nature, the easier this will be." "My new nature?" Sarah's voice cracked with desperate laughter. "You mean being your prisoner? Your pet?" "I mean being a woman who never has to worry about hunger again, who never has to choose between pride and survival." David plated the food and set it on the table. "Sit, eat, stop torturing yourself with resistance." The smell of the food was overwhelming, triggering such intense hunger that Sarah could barely think straight. Her hands shook as she approached the table, her body screaming for sustenance even as her mind rebelled against giving David what he wanted. "That's it," David murmured as she sat down. "Just give in to it. Let the hunger guide you." Sarah stared at the plate before her, fighting a war between her will and her body's demands. The food looked perfect, smelled divine, and her stomach was cramping so violently she could barely breathe. But eating it would be another step toward the madness that had claimed David's previous wives. "I won't do this," she whispered. "You will," David said with quiet certainty. "Because the alternative is agony beyond description. Because your body has already made the choice for you. Because deep down, you know you're already lost." Sarah closed her eyes, thinking of her grandmother's words about survival, about doing whatever it took to stay alive. But this wasn't survival. This was something else entirely. This was becoming a monster, losing her of piece by piece until nothing remained but hunger and need. The cramping in her stomach intensified, spreading through her entire body like fire. She doubled over in her chair, gasping for breath, her vision blurring at the edges. The withdrawal symptoms David had described were already beginning, her body demanding the sustenance it had been conditioned to crave. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was begging David to stop or to let her eat. "Just one bite," David said gently. "Just enough to make the pain stop. Then you can decide what to do next." Sarah's hand moved toward the fork without conscious thought, her body overriding her mind's protests. The hunger was becoming unbearable, a living thing that clawed at her from the inside. She could feel her resolve cracking, her grandmother's lessons about survival warring with her determination to resist David's manipulation. The fork trembled in her hand as she lifted it toward the plate. Just one bite, she told herself. Just enough to think clearly, to plan her escape. But even as she rationalized it, she knew she was lying to herself. One bite would become 2, then 10, then she would consume everything on the plate and ask for more, just as she had every day since arriving. "That's my girl," David murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. The fork was halfway to her mouth when the sound of distant gunshots cracked through the storm. Sarah froze, her head snapping up to meet David's suddenly alarmed expression. The shots came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of shouting voices barely audible over the wind. "Stay here," David commanded, moving quickly to the window. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." But Sarah was already rising from her chair, the fork clattering to the floor. The gunshots meant people, meant rescue, meant a chance to escape this nightmare. She moved toward the front door, ignoring David's sharp command to stop. "Sarah, no!" David lunged for her, but she was already pulling the door open, cold air rushing into the house like a physical blow. Through the swirling snow, she could see shapes moving in the distance. Men on horseback, their voices carrying on the wind. One of them raised a rifle and fired into the air, the shot echoing off the mountains like thunder. "Help!" Sarah screamed into the storm, her voice raw and desperate. "Help me!" David's hand closed around her arm, yanking her back from the door. "You stupid girl! Do you want to get us both killed?" "Who are they?" Sarah struggled against his grip, but he was stronger, dragging her away from the door. "Bandits," David said grimly. "They've been hitting isolated homesteads all winter, taking what they want and leaving no witnesses. If they know we're here, we're both dead." The riders were closer now, their voices more distinct. Sarah could make out at least 4 men, possibly more. They were calling to each other, coordinating their approach to the house. David slammed the door and threw the bolt, then grabbed Sarah by the shoulders. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "Whatever you think of me, whatever I've done, those men out there either are worse. They'll kill me and do things to you that will make you beg for death. Our only chance is to work together." Sarah stared into his eyes, seeing fear there for the first time since she'd arrived. The hunger was still clawing at her insides, her body still demanding the sustenance she'd denied it. But the immediate threat of the approaching riders pushed everything else aside. "What do we do?" she whispered. David released her and moved quickly to a cabinet near the fireplace, pulling out a rifle and a box of ammunition. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen, hidden under a trap door. You go down there and hide. I'll try to convince them the house is empty." "What if they don't believe you?" "Then we fight." David's face was grim as he loaded the rifle. "But Sarah, if something happens to me, if they get into the house, you stay hidden no matter what you hear. Promise me." The sound of horses' hooves was clearly audible now, circling the house. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. David led her quickly to the kitchen and pulled back a rug, revealing a wooden trapdoor she hadn't noticed before. "Down there," he said, lifting the door to reveal a narrow ladder descending into darkness. "There's food and water stored below. You can survive for days if necessary." Sarah hesitated at the edge of the opening. Going down there would mean trusting David, depending on him to protect her from the men outside. But staying up here would mean certain death or worse. "Go," David urged, the sound of approaching voices growing louder. Now, Sarah climbed down the ladder into the root cellar, a small underground room lined with shelves of preserved food and supplies. David closed the trapdoor above her, and she heard the rug being pulled back into place. Then his footsteps moved away, leaving her alone in the darkness. The cellar was cold and damp, but it felt safer than the house above. Sarah crouched in the corner, listening to the sounds filtering down from above. Heavy boots on the porch, the crash of the front door being kicked in, David's voice raised in protest and fear. "Nobody here but me," she heard him say. "Just a man trying to wait out the storm." "Funny," came a rough voice she didn't recognize. "Thought we saw someone at the window earlier. A woman, maybe." "You're mistaken. Been alone up here for weeks." The sound of furniture being overturned, drawers being pulled out and emptied. The men were searching the house, looking for valuables or signs of other occupants. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the corner, hardly daring to breathe. "Well, well," the rough voice said. "What do we have here? Looks like someone's been cooking for two." Sarah's heart sank. The breakfast dishes were still on the table, two plates with the remnants of the meal David had prepared for them. Evidence that he hadn't been alone. "I said there's nobody here," David repeated, but his voice was strained now. "And I say you're lying." The sound of a blow, David's grunt of pain. "Where is she? Where's the woman?" Sarah closed her eyes, fighting the urge to climb back up the ladder. David was being beaten because of her, because he was trying to protect her, but going up there would only get them both killed. The interrogation continued above, punctuated by the sounds of violence. Sarah could hear David's responses becoming weaker, more pained. Whatever these men wanted, they weren't going to be satisfied until they found her. The cellar seemed to shrink around Sarah as the sounds of violence continued above. Each thud, each grunt of pain from David sent waves of guilt and terror through her. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sounds, but they seemed to seep through the wooden floor like blood. "Last chance," the rough voice said. "Tell us where she is, or we start getting creative with this knife." David's response was too quiet to hear, but it must have been defiant because the sound that followed made Sarah's stomach lurch. A scream of agony that seemed to go on forever, then sudden silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. "Boss," another voice said, "maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe there ain't no woman." "There's a woman," the first voice replied with cold certainty. "I can smell her. That perfume, that fear. She's here somewhere." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She wasn't wearing perfume, hadn't worn any since arriving at the ranch. But she suddenly remembered the small leather pouch Cheryl Rodriguez had given her, the one filled with wolfsbane and sage. It was still in her dress pocket, and the herbs had a distinctive scent that might be detectable to someone with experience tracking prey. The sound of boots moving through the house grew more systematic now. They were searching room by room, checking every possible hiding place. Sarah heard them climbing the stairs, their voices growing fainter as they moved to the second floor. But they would be back down soon enough, and eventually they would find the root cellar. She looked around desperately for another way out, but the cellar had only one entrance. The walls were solid stone, the ceiling thick wooden planks. She was trapped down here as surely as she'd been trapped by David's drugs, by the storm, by her own desperate circumstances. The sound of footsteps returning to the kitchen made her press herself even deeper into the corner. They were directly above her now, and she could hear every word clearly. "Check behind that stove," the leader said, "and move that table. Look for loose floorboards, hidden doors, anything." "What about this rug?" a third voice asked. "Seems odd, having a rug in the kitchen." Sarah's heart stopped. They'd found the trap door. "Well, well," the leader said with satisfaction. "What do we have here?" The sound of the rug being pulled away, then the creak of the trapdoor opening. Light flooded down into the cellar, and Sarah squinted up at the silhouettes of three men peering down at her. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but she could see the gleam of weapons, the predatory stillness of hunters who had cornered their prey. "There she is," the leader said. "Pretty little thing, ain't you? Come on up here, darling. We won't hurt you much." Sarah remained frozen in the corner, knowing that climbing up would mean death or worse, but also knowing that staying down here would only delay the inevitable. The men had all the time in the world, and she had nowhere to run. Don't make us come down there, the leader warned. It'll go easier for you if you cooperate. When Sarah still didn't move, two of the men climbed down the ladder. In the confined space of the cellar, they seemed enormous, their presence filling the small room with menace. One of them grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet, his grip strong enough to leave bruises. That's better, he said, his breath reeking of whiskey and decay. Now let's go have a chat with your husband. They dragged her up the ladder and into the kitchen, where the sight that greeted her made her legs give out. David was tied to a chair, his face a mask of blood and bruises. His shirt had been cut away, revealing deep gashes across his chest that were still bleeding freely. But his eyes were alert, focused on her with an intensity that spoke of desperation and something else she couldn't identify. Well, well, the leader said, and Sarah got her first clear look at him. He was a big man with a scarred face and cold eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. She's even prettier than I thought. What's your name, sweetheart? Sarah said nothing, her throat too constricted, with fear to form words. Cat got your tongue? The leader backhanded her casually, the blow sending her stumbling into one of his companions. I asked you a question. Sarah, she whispered, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. Sarah, that's a nice name. I'm Donald Patel, and these are my associates. We've been having a lovely conversation with your husband here about the location of his money, his valuables, anything worth taking. But he's been most uncooperative. Sarah looked at David, seeing the pain in his eyes, but it also something else. A warning, perhaps, or a plea for her to stay strong. Whatever his faults, whatever he'd done to her, he was trying to protect her from these men. We don't have much, Sarah said. Just what you see here. Donald laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, I doubt that very much. A man living alone in a place like this, he's got to have resources. Food for the winter, money for supplies, maybe some gold hidden away for emergencies. The question is whether you're going to tell us where it is or whether we're going to have to get creative. One of the other men, a thin scarecrow of a figure with dead eyes, pulled out a knife and began cleaning his fingernails with the tip. I vote for getting creative, boss. It's been a long, boring winter. Now, David Clark, Donald said. Let's give them a chance to be reasonable first. After all, cooperation is so much more civilized than the alternative. Sarah's mind raced, trying to think of something to tell them that would satisfy their greed without revealing that she had no idea where David kept his valuables. The house was large and well-appointed, suggesting wealth, but she'd been here less than a week and had spent most of that time either eating or unconscious from whatever David had been putting in her food. The money's upstairs, David said suddenly, his voice thick with pain but steady. Hidden in the bedroom behind a loose board near the window. Donald studied him suspiciously. You're being awfully helpful all of a sudden. What changed your mind? I don't want you to hurt her, David said simply. She's innocent in all this. The leader laughed again. Innocent? Oh, I doubt that. But I appreciate the sentiment. He nodded to David Clark, who headed for the stairs. If you're lying to me, friend, I'm going to take it out on your pretty wife here, in ways that will make you both wish you'd never been born. They waited in tense silence while David Clark searched the upstairs bedroom. Sarah could hear him moving furniture, pulling up floorboards, cursing when his searches came up empty. After what felt like hours, he returned to the kitchen, empty-handed. Nothing, he reported. Tore the place apart, but there's no money up there. Donald's face darkened with rage. He turned to David, pulling out a pistol and pressing it against his temple. I don't like being lied to. Wait, Sarah said desperately. Maybe it's somewhere else. The barn or one of the outbuildings. Maybe it is, Donald agreed. But I think your husband here needs a lesson in honesty first. He cocked the pistol, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent kitchen. Please, Sarah begged. Don't kill him. I'll help you search. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't kill him. Donald studied her face, seeing the genuine terror there. You really care about him, don't you? Even though he's been keeping you prisoner up here, drugging your food, planning to do God knows what to you. Sarah's blood ran cold. How do you know about that? Because we've been watching this place for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. We saw him mixing things into your meals, saw the way you've been changing, getting bigger. more desperate. We know exactly what kind of man your husband is. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. These men had been watching her degradation, her slow transformation into one of David's victims, and had done nothing to help. They'd waited until she was trapped and vulnerable before making their move. So here's what's going to happen, Donald continued. You're going to tell us where the real money is hidden, or I'm going to put a bullet in his brain and then spend the rest of the night showing you exactly what men like us do to women like you. Sarah looked at David, seeing the resignation in his eyes. He knew he was going to die regardless of what she said or did. The only question was whether she would survive long enough to escape, and they both knew the answer to that. I don't know where the money is, she said quietly. I've only been here a week. He never told me anything about his finances. Then I guess we'll have to search the old-fashioned way, Donald said. David Clark, take the lady outside and show her the barn. Lauren Green, you stay here and keep our host company. I'll check the other buildings. The scarecrow, thin man grabbed Sarah's arm and dragged her toward the door. The storm was still raging outside, the wind so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet. But the cold air cleared her head, washing away some of the fog that had been clouding her thoughts since her arrival. As they struggled through the snow toward the barn, Sarah's mind raced. She had to find a way to escape and to get help, to somehow turn the tables on these men. But she was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard. The odds were impossibly stacked against her. The barn was dark and filled with the smell of hay and horses. David Clark lit a lantern and began searching the stalls, looking for hidden compartments or buried treasure. Sarah stood near the door, watching him work and trying to think of a way out. That's when she remembered the vial in her pocket, the one containing the substance David had been using to manipulate her appetite. It was a long shot, but it might be her only chance. I need to sit down, she said, swaying on her feet. I feel faint. David Clark barely glanced at her. Sit wherever you want. Just don't try anything stupid. Sarah sank down onto a bale of hay, palming the vial as she did so. The liquid inside was clear and odorless. But according to David, it was powerful enough to alter brain chemistry, to create uncontrollable compulsions. If she could somehow get David Clark to ingest it. You find anything yet? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Nothing so far, but there's got to be something here. A man like that doesn't live this well without money stashed somewhere. Sarah uncorked the vial carefully, keeping it hidden beneath her skirt. She needed a distraction, something to draw David Clark's attention away from what she was doing. What will happen to me, she asked, after you find what you're looking for? David Clark looked at her then, his dead eyes reflecting the lantern light. That depends on how cooperative you are. Donald likes his women willing, but he ain't too particular about it. The casual cruelty in his voice made Sarah's stomach turn, but it also strengthened her resolve. She had to act now, while she still had the chance. I'm thirsty, she said. Is there water anywhere? There's a well outside, David Clark said, returning to his search. But you ain't going nowhere until we're done here. Please, Sarah begged. Just a sip. I feel like I'm going to pass out. David Clark sighed in annoyance and pulled a flask from his coat pocket. Here, but make it quick. He tossed the flask to her, and Sarah caught it with trembling hands. This was her chance. While he was distracted by his search, and she quickly poured the contents of the vial into the flask, swirling it to mix the substances together. Thank you, she said, pretending to take a drink before handing it back to him. David Clark took the flask and drank deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Now shut up and let me work. Sarah sat back on the hay bale, her heart pounding. She had no idea how long the substance would take to work or what effect it would have on someone who wasn't already conditioned to respond to it. All she could do was wait and hope. 20 minutes passed before Sarah noticed the change in David Clark's behavior. He had been methodically searching the horse stalls, but now his movements were becoming erratic, unfocused. He would start examining one moment area, then suddenly move to another without finishing his search. His breathing had become labored, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. You feeling all right? Sarah asked innocently. David Clark wiped his face with a shaking hand. Just tired, long day. But his voice was strained, and he kept glancing around the barn as if he was seeing things that weren't there. Sarah had no idea what the drug was designed to do beyond enhancing appetite, but it was clearly having some kind of effect. David Clark's pupils were dilated, and he was beginning to mutter under his breath, words she couldn't quite make out. "Maybe you should rest for a minute," Sarah suggested. "Sit down, catch your breath." "No time," David Clark said, but his movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. He stumbled against the stall door, catching himself on the wooden frame. "Gotta find the money. Boss won't like it if I come back empty-handed." The substance was working faster than Sarah had dared hope. Whatever David James had been putting in her food was clearly potent, and David Clark's system wasn't prepared for it. She watched as he became more and more disoriented, his search becoming completely random. Then he collapsed. It happened suddenly, without warning. One moment he was standing, the next he was on the ground, convulsing violently. Foam flecked his lips, and his eyes rolled back in his head. Sarah stared in horror, realizing that she might have just killed a man. But she couldn't afford to feel guilty about it now. This was her chance to escape, to get help, to somehow turn the tables on the remaining bandits. She grabbed the lantern and David Clark's rifle, then crept to the barn door to peer outside. The storm was still raging, but she could see lights in the house windows. Donald Patel and Lauren Green were still inside with David James, probably wondering what was taking their companion so long. Sarah had maybe a few minutes before they came looking for him. She thought about her options. She could try to make it to town on foot, but that was 40 miles through a blizzard, and she'd never survive the journey. She could try to free David James and fight alongside him, but that would mean going back into the house where she'd be outnumbered 2-1. Or she could use the storm to her advantage. Sarah had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about survival, about using the environment as a weapon when you were outnumbered and outgunned. The blizzard that had trapped her here could also trap the bandits if she played her cards right. She made her way carefully around the barn to where the horses were sheltered in a lean-to. There were 4 animals there, David's 2 horses and 2 that must belong to the bandits. If she could drive them off, scatter them into the storm, the bandits would be stranded here just as surely as she was. It took some doing in the howling wind, but Sarah managed to spook the horses into running. She fired David Clark's rifle into the air, the sharp crack sending all 4 animals bolting into the white void beyond the ranch buildings. Without their mounts, Donald Patel and Lauren Green would be trapped here until the storm passed. Now she had leveled the playing field somewhat, but she was still outnumbered and outgunned. She needed another advantage, something that would tip the scales in her favor. That's when she remembered the other vials in David James's kitchen cabinet. Sarah crept back toward the house, using the storm as cover. The wind was so loud that her footsteps were completely masked, and the swirling snow made her nearly invisible, even at close range. She made it to the kitchen window and peered inside. Donald Patel was standing over David James, who was still tied to the chair, but now unconscious, his head lolling forward. Lauren Green was nowhere to be seen, probably searching other parts of the house. This might be her only chance to get to the cabinet where David kept his chemical arsenal. The back door was unlocked, and Sarah slipped inside as quietly as she could. The kitchen was warm after the bitter cold outside, and she had to resist the urge to simply stand there and thaw out. Every second counted now. She could hear Donald Patel talking in the next room, his voice raised in frustration. "Where the hell is David Clark? He should have been back by now." Sarah crept to the cabinet and pulled out the remaining vials. There were 3 left, each labeled with a different woman's name and a different chemical compound. She had no idea what any of them were designed to do, but they were clearly powerful substances. Maybe she could use them as weapons. "Lauren Green," Donald Patel called. "Get down here. We need to check on David Clark." Footsteps on the stairs, coming fast. Sarah pocketed the vials and looked around desperately for a place to hide. The pantry was too obvious, the root cellar too far away. She settled for crouching behind the kitchen table, hoping the shadows would conceal her. Lauren Green appeared in the doorway, a stocky woman with hard eyes and scarred hands. She was carrying a shotgun and looked like she knew how to use it. "What do you want, Donald?" "David Clark's been gone too long. Something's wrong. I want you to go check on him." "Why me? Send the girl." "The girl's with him, remember?" "That's what I'm worried about." Lauren Green sighed and headed for the back door. Sarah held her breath as the woman passed within arm's reach of her hiding spot, but Lauren Green was focused on the storm outside and didn't notice the figure crouched in the shadows. As soon as Lauren Green was gone, Sarah crept toward the living room where Donald Patel was standing over David James. She could see that David was breathing but unconscious, probably from blood loss or the beating he'd taken. She needed to wake him up, get him free, but first she had to deal with Donald Patel. The bandit leader was facing away from her, looking out the front window at the storm. Sarah pulled out one of the vials, this one labeled metabolic accelerant, Rebecca C. She had no idea what it would do, but she remembered David's description of Rebecca Chen throwing herself from a second-floor window rather than live with whatever he'd done to her. The kitchen had a bottle of whiskey on the counter, probably something David used for cooking or medicinal purposes. Sarah uncorked both the whiskey and the vial, then mixed them together as quietly as she could. The liquid in the vial was slightly yellow, and it seemed to dissolve completely into the alcohol. Now she just had to get Donald Patel to drink it. "Don't move," she said, stepping into the living room with David Clark's rifle pointed at Donald Patel's back. The bandit leader froze, then slowly turned around. When he saw her, his scarred face split into a grin that made her blood run cold. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Where's David Clark?" "Sweetheart." "Dead," Sarah lied, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Your friend had an unfortunate accident in the barn." Donald Patel's grin faded. "You're lying." Why don't you go check for yourself?" Sarah kept the rifle trained on his chest, though she wasn't sure she could actually pull the trigger if it came to that. "But first you're going to untie my husband, and then we're all going to have a drink to celebrate our new understanding." "What understanding would that be?" "The one where you leave here empty-handed but alive, instead of staying here permanently in the ground." Donald Patel laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "You think you can threaten me, little girl? I've killed more people than you've probably met. What makes you think you're any different?" "Because I'm desperate," Sarah said simply, "and desperate people do desperate things." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Donald Patel moved slowly to David James and began untying the ropes. David stirred as the bonds were removed, his eyes fluttering open to focus on Sarah with confusion and something that might have been admiration. "Can you stand?" Sarah asked him. David tested his legs, wincing at the pain from his injuries but managing to stay upright. "I think so." "Good. Now, Donald, I want you to pour 3 glasses of that whiskey on the mantel. We're going to drink to our mutual survival." Donald Patel looked at her suspiciously. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just a drink between civilized people before you leave." The bandit leader moved to the mantel and poured 3 glasses of whiskey. Sarah watched carefully, making sure he didn't switch the bottles or try any tricks. When he was done, she gestured for him to step back. "David, take the glasses and hand one to our guest," she said. David James moved slowly, his injuries making every step painful, but he managed to distribute the glasses. Sarah made sure Donald Patel got the one with the doctored whiskey, then raised her own glass in a mock toast. "To survival," she said. "To survival," Donald Patel agreed and drained his glass in one swallow. Sarah and David pretended to drink, but Sarah was watching Donald Patel's face intently. She had no idea how long the substance would take to work, or what it would do when it did. All she knew was that it had driven Rebecca Chen to suicide, and that might be enough to incapacitate the bandit leader. "Now what?" Donald Patel asked, setting down his empty glass. "Now we wait for Lauren Green to come back, and then you both leave," Sarah said. Simple as that. But even as she spoke, she could see changes beginning in Donald Patel's face. His pupils were dilating, and a fine sheen of sweat was appearing on his forehead. Whatever the substance was, it was starting to work. The sound of the back door opening made them all turn. Lauren Green appeared in the doorway, her shotgun raised and her face grim. "David Clark's dead," she announced. "Found him in the barn, convulsing like he'd been poisoned." Donald Patel swayed on his feet, gripping the mantel for support. "Poisoned? Looks like it, and the horses are gone too. Scattered to the 4 winds." Lauren Green's eyes fixed on Sarah. "You've been busy, haven't you, little girl?" Sarah kept the rifle trained on Lauren Green, but she knew she was outgunned now. The shotgun would cut her in half at this range, and there was no cover in the living room. Her only hope was that the substance she'd given Donald Patel would incapacitate him quickly enough to even the odds. "Drop the rifle," Lauren Green commanded. "Now." Sarah hesitated, looking at David James. He was barely standing, in no condition to fight, but his eyes met hers with a look of understanding. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. "I said drop it." Sarah was about to comply when Donald Patel suddenly screamed. It was a sound of pure agony, inhuman and terrifying. He doubled over, clutching his stomach, then began convulsing violently. Lauren Green spun toward him in alarm, her shotgun wavering. That moment of distraction was all David James needed. Despite his injuries, he launched himself at Lauren Green, tackling her around the waist and sending them both crashing to the floor. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling, filling the room with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Sarah dove for cover behind the sofa as David and Lauren Green wrestled for control of the weapon. She could hear them grunting and cursing, the sound of fists hitting flesh, but she couldn't see what was happening through the smoke. Donald Patel was still screaming, his voice becoming increasingly inhuman. Whatever Rebecca Chen had experienced, whatever had driven her to throw herself from a window, Donald Patel was experiencing it now. The sound was so horrible that Sarah had to cover her ears. A gunshot cracked through the chaos, then sudden silence. Sarah peered over the sofa to see David James standing over Lauren Green's still form, the shotgun in his hands. Blood was streaming from a cut on his forehead, and his shirt was torn, but he was alive. Donald Patel had stopped screaming. He lay curled in a fetal position near the fireplace, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something only he could see. "Is he dead?" Sarah asked. "No," David said grimly, "but I think he wishes he was." Sarah stared at the carnage in the living room, her hands trembling as she lowered the rifle. Lauren Green lay motionless near the overturned table, a dark pool spreading beneath her head. Donald Patel continued to writhe by the fireplace, lost in whatever nightmare the chemical compound had unleashed in his mind. The silence that followed the gunshot seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. David James swayed on his feet, the shotgun still clutched in his bloodied hands. His face was pale from blood loss, and Sarah could see that his strength was failing. Whatever adrenaline had carried him through the fight was rapidly fading, leaving behind the reality of his injuries. "We need to get you cleaned up," Sarah said, moving toward him with careful steps. The floorboards creaked under her feet, each sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Sarah." David's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "What you did tonight, what you risked to save me after everything I've done to you. I don't deserve it." She stopped a few feet away from him, studying his battered face. The man who had drugged her, manipulated her body chemistry, planned to make her another victim in his twisted collection of wives, had also tried to protect her from men who would have done far worse. The complexity of it made her head spin. "Maybe neither of us deserves what we've gotten," she said finally, "but we're alive, and they're not. That has to count for something." David nodded slowly, then looked down at Donald Patel, who had gone quiet but continued to stare at something invisible in the air above him. "The compound I gave him, it was designed to accelerate metabolic processes." Rebecca Chen experienced complete system overload within hours. Her heart couldn't handle the strain. "You mean he's dying?" Slowly, painfully, the way Rebecca did. David's expression was grim. "I told myself I was helping her, giving her the gift of never being hungry again. Instead, I created a monster that consumed her from the inside out." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm still raging outside. She thought of her own altered appetite, the way food had become an obsession since her arrival. "What about me? What did you do to me?" David set the shotgun aside and sank into a chair, his injuries making every movement painful. "A different compound, milder, designed to enhance appetite gradually, to create psychological dependence rather than physical destruction. I thought I had learned from my mistakes. But it's still changing me." Sarah touched her stomach, feeling the solid weight of all the food she'd consumed over the past week. Her body felt different, heavier, more substantial than it had been when she arrived. "How long before it becomes permanent?" "The physical changes will reverse themselves over time once you stop ingesting the compound. The psychological effects, David hesitated. Those may take longer to fade. Sarah moved to the window and peered out at the storm. The snow was still falling heavily, but the wind seemed to have lessened slightly. Dawn was still hours away, but she could sense that the worst of the blizzard was passing. Soon the roads would be passable again, and she would have to make a choice about her future. Why? She asked without turning around. Why did you do this? What drove you to become the kind of man who drugs women and keeps them prisoner? David was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of isolation and regret. I was married once before I came to Montana. Her name was Catherine, and she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Delicate, refined, everything a man could want in a wife, but she was also fragile, unable to handle the hardships of frontier life. She died during our first winter together, wasted away from a fever that her weakened body couldn't fight. Sarah turned to face him, seeing the pain etched in every line of his face. I swore I would never watch another woman die from weakness, from an inability to survive in this harsh country. When I started looking for a new wife, I told myself I was being practical. I would find women who were already strong, already proven survivors. But when they arrived, I saw the same fragility in them that I'd seen in Catherine. The same delicate appetites, the same reluctance to take what they needed to survive. So you decided to force them to be strong. I decided to help them embrace their survival instincts, to make them understand that in a place like this, you eat when food is available. You take what you need. You never waste an opportunity to store up strength for the lean times ahead. David's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Your grandmother understood that. She taught you that a woman who can eat anything can survive anything. Sarah felt a stab of anger at hearing her grandmother's words twisted to justify David's actions. Abuela taught me about survival, yes, but she also taught me about dignity, about maintaining your humanity even in the worst circumstances. What you did to those women, what you tried to do to me, that wasn't survival. That was control. Control over what? Over their bodies, over their choices, over their ability to leave you if they wanted to. Sarah moved closer to him, her voice rising with each word. You didn't want strong women, David. You wanted prisoners who were too dependent on you to escape. David flinched as if she'd struck him. That's not true, isn't it? Mary Patterson tried to leave, and you let her die in the snow rather than let her go. Elena Vasquez went mad from whatever you did to her, and Rebecca Chen killed herself rather than live with the changes you forced on her body. 3 women dead because you couldn't bear the thought of being alone. The accusation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. David stared at her, his face cycling through denial, anger, and finally a crushing recognition of the truth in her words. I never meant for them to die, he whispered. I thought I was saving them. From what? From the world, from hunger, from want, from all the things that had driven them to answer my advertisement in the first place. I thought if I could make them need me, truly need me, they would be happy here. They would be grateful. Sarah shook her head, feeling a mixture of pity and revulsion. You can't make someone grateful by taking away their choice. You can't create love through dependency. Donald Patel's breathing had become increasingly labored, each inhalation a struggle. His eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only white, and a thin line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Whatever the compound was doing to his system, it was reaching its final stages. He's dying, Sarah observed. Yes. David didn't look at the man on the floor. It won't be long now. Good. The word came out harder than Sarah had intended, but she didn't regret it. Donald Patel and his companions had come here to rob and murder, had threatened her with fates worse than death. Whatever David's crimes, at least he had never intended to harm her physically. The storm outside was definitely weakening now. Sarah could see patches of stars through the breaking clouds, and the howling wind had diminished to a steady whisper. By morning, the roads would be clear enough for travel, assuming anyone came looking for her. What happens now? David asked, as if reading her thoughts. Sarah considered the question. She could leave, try to make it back to town and report what had happened here. But who would believe her story? A mail-order bride claiming that her husband had drugged her while she helped him kill 3 bandits? The authorities would be more likely to arrest her as an accomplice than to see her as a victim. She could stay, try to build some kind of life with David despite everything that had happened. But how could she trust a man who had manipulated her so completely? How could she live with a woman who had caused the deaths of 3 other women, even if he claimed it was unintentional? Or she could forge a third path, one that neither of them had considered. "I want to see Mary's grave," she said suddenly. David looked up at her in surprise. "What?" "Mary Patterson, Elena Vasquez, Rebecca Chen. I want to see where you buried them." "Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea. The ground is frozen, and with the storm—" "I want to see their graves," Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a tone of finality that brooked no argument. "If we're going to move forward from this, if there's going to be any kind of future between us, I need to understand what happened to them. I need to pay my respects." David studied her face, seeing the determination there. After a long moment, he nodded. "When the storm passes, when it's safe to go outside." Donald Patel drew one last rattling breath and went still. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the diminishing wind outside. Sarah felt no sadness at his passing, only a grim satisfaction that justice had been served, even if it came through the same methods David had used on his victims. "We'll need to bury them," David said, gesturing toward the 2 bodies. "Lauren Green and Donald Patel, and David Clark in the barn. After I see the other graves." "After you see the other graves," David agreed. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the dissipating storm clouds into a gray, cold light that revealed the extent of the previous night's snowfall. Drifts reached nearly to the windows in some places, and the landscape had been transformed into an alien wilderness of white shapes and shadows. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun struggle to break through the overcast sky. She had spent the night in Mary Patterson's room, unable to sleep in her own bed, knowing what David had been putting in her food. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her insides, but it felt different now, more manageable, less desperate. Perhaps knowing the source of her compulsion had robbed it of some of its power. David appeared in the doorway, moving stiffly but under his own power. He had cleaned and bandaged his wounds during the night, and while he looked pale and battered, he was clearly going to survive. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked. "Like I've been trampled by cattle," David admitted, "but alive, thanks to you." Sarah nodded but didn't respond to the gratitude in his voice. She wasn't ready to forgive him, wasn't sure she ever would be. But they were bound together now by what they had shared, by the violence they had survived and the secrets they both carried. "The storm's passed," she observed. "Mostly. There might be more snow later, but the worst is over." David joined her at the window, careful to maintain some distance between them. "The graves are about a quarter-mile from the house, up on the ridge where the ground drains well. It'll be a difficult walk in this snow." "I can manage it." "I know you can." David's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "Sarah, what you did last night, the way you handled yourself under pressure, it showed me something about your character that I hadn't seen before. You're not just a survivor, you're a fighter." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that might have been admiration mixed with regret. "Is that what you were looking for? A fighter?" "I thought I was looking for someone who would be grateful for security, for protection from the harsh realities of frontier life. But what I really needed was someone who could stand beside me as an equal, someone strong enough to challenge me when I was wrong." David's voice grew quieter. "Someone like you." The words hung between them. An offer and an apology rolled into one. Sarah felt the weight of the choice before her. She could accept what he was offering, try to build something real from the ashes of his deception. Or she could walk away, leave this place and these memories behind, start fresh somewhere else. "Show me the graves first," she said. "Then we'll talk about the future." They prepared for the journey in silence, bundling themselves in heavy coats and boots suitable for deep snow. David strapped on snowshoes and handed a pair to Sarah, showing her how to secure the bindings properly. The ritual of preparation felt strangely domestic, like something a real husband and wife might do before venturing out to check on their livestock. The walk to the ridge was exhausting. The snow was deeper than it had appeared from the house, and even with snowshoes, each step required considerable effort. Sarah's legs burned with the exertion, and her lungs ached from breathing the thin, cold air. But she pressed on, driven by a need she couldn't fully articulate. The graves were marked by simple wooden crosses, weathered by exposure to the elements, but still clearly readable. Mary Patterson, Elena Vasquez, Rebecca Chen, three women who had come to this place seeking security and found only death. Sarah stood before the first grave, trying to imagine the woman who lay beneath the frozen earth. Mary Patterson, who had survived the crossing from Ireland only to perish in the Montana wilderness. What had her last thoughts been as she fled into the storm? Had she felt relief at escaping David's control, or only terror at the cold and darkness closing in around her? "Tell me about her," Sarah said. "The real Mary, not the version you created in your mind." David was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "She was brave," he said finally. "Braver than I gave her credit for. She had lost her entire family to disease in Ireland, sold everything she owned to pay for passage to America. When she answered my advertisement, she wasn't looking for romance. She was looking for survival. But you tried to give her more than that. I tried to give her what I thought she needed: security, abundance, a reason never to worry about hunger again. But she saw through my methods, understood what I was doing to her body and her mind. She confronted me about it during her last week here." Sarah moved to Elena's grave, noting how the cross leaned slightly to one side. "And Elena Vasquez?" "Elena was different, tougher, more experienced with frontier life. She lasted longer because she was better equipped to handle the physical challenges, but the psychological pressure broke her in the end. She became obsessed with food, with eating, to the point where it consumed every waking moment. I found her in the kitchen one night, trying to eat raw flour mixed with lard because she had already consumed everything else in the house. The image was horrifying, but Sarah forced herself to listen. She needed to understand the full scope of what David had done, the complete consequences of his actions. She knew what was happening to her. By the end, yes, but the compulsion was too strong to resist. She begged me to help her stop, to find some way to reverse what I had done, but I didn't know how. The compounds I was using were experimental, based on research I had read in medical journals, but never fully understood. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "You were experimenting on them. I was trying to help them adapt to frontier life, to give them the tools they needed to survive. But yes, I suppose in the end, that's what it was: experimentation on unwilling subjects." David's voice was heavy with self-loathing. "Elena died during a seizure brought on by malnutrition, ironically enough. Her body had become so dependent on constant intake that when she tried to fast, to break the cycle, her system shut down." They stood in silence before Elena's grave, the weight of her tragedy settling over them like the snow that continued to fall lightly from the gray sky. Sarah tried to imagine what it would be like to lose control of your own hunger so completely, to become a prisoner of your own appetite. Rebecca Chen's grave was the smallest, and the cross bore the most recent date. Sarah knelt beside it, brushing away the snow to reveal the carved letters beneath. "She was the youngest," David said, "barely 18 when she arrived. I thought her youth would make her more adaptable, more resilient. Instead, it made her more fragile." "What happened to her?" "The compound I used on Rebecca was different from the others. I thought I had refined the formula, made it gentler, more gradual in its effects. But Rebecca's body chemistry was unusual. Instead of enhancing her appetite gradually, the substance caused rapid, uncontrolled changes. She gained 30 pounds in 6 weeks, and her behavior became increasingly erratic." Sarah stood up, her knees stiff from kneeling in the snow. "Erratic how?" "Mood swings, paranoia, episodes where she would eat compulsively and then become violently ill. She accused me of trying to turn her into a monster, said she could feel something alien growing inside her, changing her from within." David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She wasn't wrong. So she killed herself." She threw herself from the second-floor window during a blizzard, wearing nothing but her nightgown. I found her the next morning, half buried in a snowdrift. The fall had broken her neck, but she was already dying from exposure. Sarah stared at the small cross marking Rebecca's resting place, feeling a profound sadness for this girl she had never met. 18 years old, probably full of hopes and dreams for her new life in Montana, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare of David's making. "Why didn't you stop?" Sarah asked. "After Mary died, after Elena, why did you keep trying?" "Because I couldn't accept that I was the problem," David said simply. "I told myself that each failure taught me something new, that the next time would be different. I was so convinced that my methods were sound that I just needed to find the right woman, the right combination of circumstances. And when you saw my advertisement response, I thought you were perfect, desperate enough to be grateful, strong enough to survive the process, hungry enough to appreciate what I was offering. I told myself that this time would be different, that I had finally learned from my mistakes." Sarah turned away from the graves and looked back toward the house, a dark shape against the white landscape. From this distance, it looked peaceful, welcoming even, but she knew the truth that lay beneath its comfortable facade. "Those men last night," she said, "Donald Patel and the others. You said they'd been watching the house. For several days, according to what they told me. They saw you arrive, saw the changes in your behavior, your appearance. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. But they didn't try to help me, they just watched. Men like that don't help anyone but themselves. They saw an opportunity for profit and waited for the right moment to exploit it." David's voice carried a note of bitter irony. "In some ways, they were no different from me." The comparison stung because it contained a grain of truth. Both David and the bandits had seen her as something to be used, exploited for their own purposes. The only difference was the nature of their intentions. "I need to think," Sarah said, "about what happens next, about whether there's any way forward from here." "I understand." David began the trek back toward the house, moving slowly through the deep snow. "Take all the time you need." The house felt different when they returned from the ridge. The bodies of Lauren Green and Donald Patel Moen had stiffened during the night, their presence a constant reminder of the violence that had taken place. Sarah helped David drag them outside to a storage shed, where they would remain frozen until the ground thawed enough for proper burial. David Clark's body in the barn required similar handling, though Sarah felt less conflicted about his death. She had killed him in self-defense, using David's own methods against one of his attackers. There was a certain poetic justice in it, even if the act itself left her feeling hollow. "We'll need to report this to the sheriff eventually," David said as they secured the shed door. 3 dead men, all armed and clearly intent on robbery and murder. It should be ruled self-defense. "Should be," Sarah repeated. "But will it?" "That depends on how we tell the story, and whether you're willing to stay and corroborate my account." The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah understood the implications. If she left now, David would have to explain the deaths of 3 bandits on his own, with no witnesses to support his version of events. If she stayed, she would be committing herself to a shared future built on shared secrets. They returned to the house in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The kitchen still showed signs of the previous night's violence, and Sarah began the methodical process of cleaning up. It felt good to have something concrete to focus on, a task that required attention but not deep thought. David disappeared upstairs, returning with an armload of clothing and personal items. Sarah recognized some of the dresses from Mary Patterson's wardrobe, along with jewelry and other feminine accessories. "These belong to them," David said, setting the items on the kitchen table. "Mary, Elena, Rebecca. I kept everything, told myself it was out of respect for their memory. But really, I think it was guilt." Sarah examined the items, noting the quality of the fabrics and the careful craftsmanship of the jewelry. These women had not been paupers when they died. They had possessed things of value, things that spoke of lives lived before they came to this remote ranch. "What will you do with them?" "Burn them, I think. It's time to let go of the past, to stop living with ghosts." David picked up a small locket that had belonged to Elena, opening it to reveal a faded photograph of a young man in military uniform. They deserve to rest in peace, not to have their belongings kept as trophies by the man who caused their deaths. Sarah nodded, understanding the symbolic importance of the gesture. But she also saw an opportunity for something more meaningful. Don't burn them, she said. Send them back to their families, if any can be found, along with letters explaining what happened, apologizing for their deaths. It won't bring them back, but it might provide some closure for the people who loved them. David looked at her with surprise. You think their families would want to know the truth? The whole truth about what I did to them? I think they deserve to know. And I think you deserve to face the consequences of your actions, even if those consequences are just the knowledge that people out there know what kind of man you really are. The suggestion clearly made David uncomfortable, but he nodded slowly. You're right, it's the least I can do for them. They spent the rest of the morning going through the belongings, sorting items that might have sentimental value to surviving family members. David proved surprisingly knowledgeable about the women's backgrounds, having kept detailed records of their correspondence before their arrivals. Mary had a sister in Boston, he said, holding up a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. They wrote to each other regularly until Mary came here. The sister must be wondering what happened to her. And Elena? Parents in Texas and a brother who served in the cavalry. Rebecca's family is in California, but I'm not sure they're still at the same address. Sarah made notes as they worked, creating a plan for returning the belongings and crafting the difficult letters that would have to accompany them. It was grim work, but it felt necessary, a way of honoring the dead and acknowledging the full scope of David's crimes. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself studying David with new eyes. The man who had drugged her, manipulated her, planned to make her another victim in his collection, was also capable of genuine remorse and a desire to make amends. The complexity of it frustrated her, made it impossible to simply categorize him as a monster and walk away. Why are you doing this? David asked during a break in their work. Helping me contact their families, plan proper restitution. After everything I've done to you, you'd be justified in leaving me to face the consequences alone. Sarah considered the question, trying to understand her own motivations. Because someone needs to speak for them. Mary, Elena, Rebecca. They can't tell their own stories anymore. Can't demand justice for what was done to them. If I walk away now, their deaths become just another frontier tragedy, forgotten by everyone except the man who caused them. And if you stay? If I stay, I become complicit in whatever happens next. I become part of the story, for better or worse. Sarah met his eyes directly. The question is whether you're capable of becoming a different kind of man than you've been. Whether you can learn to see women as partners instead of possessions. I want to try, David said quietly, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to change patterns that have been years in the making. Then we'll find out together. The words surprised Sarah as much as they seemed to surprise David. She hadn't consciously made the decision to stay, hadn't weighed all the factors and come to a rational conclusion. But somehow in the process of honoring the dead women's memories, she had found a path forward that felt right. You're staying, David asked. I'm staying, but not as your victim and not as your prisoner. If we're going to make this work, it has to be as equals. No more drugs, no more manipulation, no more attempts to control my behavior or my body. Agreed. And we tell the truth about what happened here. To the sheriff, to anyone who asks, no cover-ups, no lies to protect your reputation. David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of public exposure. But after a moment, he nodded. Agreed. And we make sure those women get proper headstones with their full names and dates, not just wooden crosses, but real markers that will last. Yes, Sarah felt a sense of resolution settling over her, a feeling that she was making the right choice despite all the reasons to doubt it. She thought of her grandmother's words about survival, about doing whatever it took to stay alive, but she also thought about dignity, about maintaining your humanity even in the worst circumstances. There's one more thing, she said. What? I want to know everything about those compounds you used, the formulas, the effects, how to counteract them. If we're going to move forward, I need to understand exactly what was done to my body and how to undo it. David nodded slowly. The effects should fade naturally over the next few weeks as the substances clear your system. But I can give you the antidote formulas I developed, the ones I never had the courage to use on Mary or Elena. You had antidotes? Theoretical ones. I was too afraid to test them, too afraid of what might happen if they didn't work. David's voice was heavy with regret. Another failure of courage on my part. Sarah felt a flash of anger at this revelation, but she pushed it aside. Anger wouldn't change the past, and it wouldn't help her build a future. What mattered now was moving forward, learning from the mistakes that had been made, and ensuring that no other women would suffer the same fate as Mary, Elena, and Rebecca. The afternoon was spent in practical preparations. They drafted letters to the families of the deceased women, carefully explaining what had happened while taking full responsibility for their deaths. David proved to be a surprisingly eloquent writer when forced to confront the truth of his actions. They also began planning the logistics of their new arrangement. Sarah would have her own room, her own space, her own freedom to come and go as she pleased. David would handle the ranch operations and the eventual legal proceedings, while Sarah would manage the household and the correspondence with the victims' families. It wasn't a traditional marriage, and it certainly wasn't the romantic partnership either of them might have envisioned. But it was honest, built on a foundation of shared truth rather than deception and manipulation. As evening approached, Sarah found herself standing once again at the kitchen window, watching the sun set over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a world that looked clean and new, washed by wind and snow into something resembling innocence. "Do you think they can forgive me?" David asked, joining her at the window. "The families of the women who died here?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly, "but I think the fact that you're asking the question is a start." "And you, can you forgive me?" Sarah considered the question, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between them. The manipulation, the drugs, the lies, but also the protection he had tried to offer, the remorse he clearly felt, the willingness to change that he was demonstrating. "Ask me again in a year," she said finally, "after we've seen whether you can keep the promises you're making." David nodded, accepting the uncertainty as fair. "What about tonight? Are you comfortable staying here, sleeping under the same roof?" "I'll lock my door," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Just like you advised on my first night here." That was different. I was trying to protect you from something outside. And now I'm protecting myself from something inside. From the temptation to trust too quickly, to forgive too easily. Sarah turned to face him fully. "David, I need you to understand something. I'm not staying here because I love you or because I believe in some romantic future for us. I'm staying because I believe people can change and because those women deserve to have their stories told properly." "I understand. Do you? Because if you're expecting me to become the grateful, dependent wife you originally wanted, you're going to be disappointed. I'm going to challenge you, question you, hold you accountable for your actions. If that's not what you want, tell me now." David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the fading light. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. "Sarah, what I wanted was a woman who would never leave me, who would be so dependent on what I provided that she couldn't imagine life anywhere else. What I needed was someone strong enough to stay by choice, someone who could see my flaws and help me become better than I am." He paused, then continued, "I think you might be that person." "We'll see," Sarah said. "We'll see." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and revealing the secrets that winter had hidden. Sarah stood in the garden behind the house, her hands deep in the rich, dark soil as she planted vegetables that would feed them through the coming year. The physical work felt good, grounding her in the present moment and the simple realities of survival. 3 months had passed since the night of the storm, 3 months of careful negotiations and gradual trust building between her and David. The sheriff had come and gone, accepting their account of the bandit attack with minimal questioning. Self-defense was a well-understood concept on the frontier, and the reputation of Donald Patel's gang preceded them. The letters to the victims' families had been sent, along with their personal belongings and substantial monetary compensation from David's savings. 2 families had responded, thanking them for the closure while making it clear that forgiveness would be a long time coming. The third letter had been returned as undeliverable, the family apparently having moved on to parts unknown. Sarah had kept her promise to hold David accountable for his actions. She questioned his decisions, challenged his assumptions, and refused to accept his word on matters that affected her directly. It was exhausting work, this constant vigilance, but she could see changes in him that gave her hope. The hunger that had once consumed her thoughts had faded to manageable levels, though she still ate more than she had before coming to the ranch. David had been true to his word about the antidote formulas, providing her with detailed instructions for reversing the effects of his compounds. Her body was returning to something resembling its natural state, though the experience had left her with a deeper appreciation for the simple pleasure of a satisfying meal. The headstones arrived, David called from the house. Sarah looked up from her planting, wiping dirt from her hands on her apron. They had ordered proper granite markers for the 3 graves, with full names and dates carved in elegant script. It had taken months to have them made and shipped from Denver, but Sarah had insisted on the expense. "Are they what we ordered?" she asked, walking toward the house. "Better than I expected. The stone cutter did beautiful work." David held the door open for her, a gesture of courtesy that had become natural over the months of their cohabitation. "We can install them tomorrow if the weather holds." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction at this final step in honoring the dead women's memories. It wasn't enough to make up for their deaths, but it was something tangible, a recognition of their worth as human beings rather than failed experiments. The house had changed over the months as well. Sarah had removed all traces of David's previous wives except for one small photograph of each woman, displayed respectfully on the mantelpiece as a reminder of the cost of his past actions. She had also insisted on changes to the kitchen, removing the locked cabinet where he had stored his compounds and replacing it with open shelves that held nothing more dangerous than common spices. "I received a letter from Mary's sister today," David said, settling into his chair by the fireplace. "She's planning to visit this summer to see where Mary is buried." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect. Meeting the family members of David's victims would be difficult, but it was also necessary. These people deserved to see the place where their loved ones had died, to ask their questions and receive honest answers. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that she's welcome here, that we'll answer any questions she has, and that we'll do whatever we can to help her find peace with what happened to Mary." It was the right response, but Sarah knew it would be a challenging visit for all of them. Mary's sister would be looking at David with the knowledge of what he had done to her sibling, and she would be looking at Sarah with questions about why she had chosen to stay with such a man. "Are you prepared for the questions she'll ask?" Sarah said. "About us, about why I'm here, about whether you've changed?" "I think so, but I'm more concerned about whether you're prepared. She's going to want to understand your motivations, your decision to stay. And I'm not sure I fully understand them myself." Sarah considered the question, one that she had asked herself many times over the past months. Why had she stayed? Why had she chosen to build a life with a man who had drugged her, manipulated her, caused the deaths of 3 other women? "I stayed because someone needed to bear witness," she said finally, "to make sure the story was told honestly, to ensure that Mary and Elena and Rebecca weren't forgotten or reduced to convenient lies. But I also stayed because I believe in the possibility of redemption, even for someone who has done terrible things." "And now, after 3 months of living with the reality of who I am, do you still believe in that possibility?" Sarah looked at David, seeing the changes that had taken place in him over their months together. He was more careful now, more thoughtful about the impact of his actions on others. He asked for her opinion on matters large and small, and he actually listened to her responses. He had started attending church services in town, seeking some kind of spiritual guidance for his path forward. But she also saw the man who had been capable of systematic manipulation and murder, who had rationalized his actions as kindness while causing immense suffering. The capacity for both good and evil existed within him, and she could never forget that. "I believe you're trying to change," she said. "I believe you're genuinely remorseful about what you did to those women. But I also believe that kind of change is a lifelong process, not something that can be accomplished in a few months." "So you're staying to monitor my progress?" "I'm staying because this has become my home too, because the work we're doing here, the letters we're writing, the way we're trying to honor the dead, it feels important. It feels like something worth doing." David nodded slowly, accepting her explanation, even as she could see he wanted something more definitive from her. But Sarah had learned to be cautious with her trust, to offer it in small increments rather than wholesale declarations. The evening passed quietly, with Sarah working on correspondence while David read from a book of poetry he had ordered from Denver. It was a peaceful domestic scene, one that might have looked normal to an outside observer. But Sarah was always aware of the undercurrents, the history that lay beneath their careful politeness. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate day when she had answered David's advertisement. She had come here starving and desperate, willing to accept almost any arrangement that offered security. Now she was well-fed and reasonably content, but also more aware of her own strength and capabilities. The woman who had fled poverty in town would never have been able to handle the bandit attack, would never have had the presence of mind to use David's own methods against his enemies. The woman who had been so grateful for a simple meal would never have had the confidence to demand equality in her relationship with her benefactor. In some twisted way, David's manipulation had revealed strengths in her that might have remained hidden under normal circumstances. She had learned that she could survive extreme situations, that she could make difficult moral choices under pressure, that she could hold her ground against men who tried to control her. It was a bitter irony that the man who had tried to make her dependent had actually made her more independent, more self-reliant, more aware of her own worth. Sarah locked her bedroom door, as she had every night since deciding to stay. The gesture was partly practical, a reminder to both of them about the boundaries of their relationship. But it was also symbolic, a declaration that she maintained control over her own body and her own choices, regardless of the circumstances that had brought her here. As she settled into bed, Sarah thought about the future that lay ahead of them. Mary's sister would visit, bringing with her the pain and anger of a family destroyed by David's actions. Other challenges would arise, tests of their commitment to honesty and change. The work of redemption, if such a thing was even possible, would continue for years to come. But for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sarah felt a sense of cautious optimism about what lay ahead. She had survived the worst that David could do to her, had found ways to turn his methods against his enemies, had forged a relationship based on truth rather than deception. She had eaten everything he had put before her, both literally and figuratively, and had asked for more. Not because she was grateful or dependent, but because she was strong enough to digest even the most difficult truths and transform them into something she could live with. In the darkness of her room, Sarah smiled at the thought. Her grandmother had been right about Sararmoan, about the importance of being able to consume whatever life offered. But Abuela had also taught her about dignity, about maintaining your humanity even in the worst circumstances. Sarah had done both. She had survived, and she had remained human. It was enough for now. It was enough to build on. Summer arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that made the winter's cold seem like a distant memory. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead as she worked in the expanded garden, harvesting vegetables that would feed them through the coming year. The physical work had changed her body in ways that David's drugs never could, building real strength rather than artificial dependency. The sound of approaching horses made her look up from the tomato plants. A wagon was making its way up the long drive to the house, kicking up dust in the dry air. Sarah shaded her eyes with her hand, making out the figure of a woman in traveling clothes sitting beside the driver. "David," she called toward the house. "She's here!" Mary Patterson's sister had arrived exactly as promised, traveling from Boston to see where her sibling had died and to meet the people responsible for her death. Sarah had been dreading this moment for weeks, unsure how she would explain her presence here, her decision to stay with the man who had killed Mary. David emerged from the house, his face pale but determined. Over the past months, he had prepared extensively for this meeting, gathering Mary's belongings, drafting detailed accounts of her time at the ranch, and steeling himself to face the anger and pain of her surviving family. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the house, and the woman climbed down with the assistance of the driver. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and the kind of steady composure that spoke of a life spent dealing with hardship. Her resemblance to Mary was unmistakable, visible in the shape of her face and the set of her shoulders. "Mrs. Catherine O'Brien," David said, stepping forward with his hat in his hands. "Thank you for making the journey. I'm David James, and this is Sarah Flores." Catherine O'Brien studied them both with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Sarah could see her taking in the details of their appearance, their relationship, the evidence of prosperity that surrounded them. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight Irish accent that had probably been much stronger in her youth. "Mr. James, Miss Flores." She nodded to each of them in turn. "I've come to see where my sister died, and to understand what happened to her in this place." "Of course," David said. "We've prepared Mary's room for you to stay in, and we have all of her belongings ready for you to examine. We want to answer any questions you have, no matter how difficult they might be." Catherine's expression softened slightly at the mention of Mary's room. "You've kept it intact?" "Until recently, yes. Sarah convinced me that it was time to let go, to pack away Mary's things with proper respect rather than leaving them as a shrine to my guilt." It was an honest answer, one that seemed to surprise Catherine. She had clearly been prepared for evasions and self-justification, not this direct acknowledgement of responsibility. Sarah stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. "Mrs. O'Brien, I know you must have questions about why I'm here, about my relationship with David. I want you to know that I'll answer them honestly, even if the answers are complicated." "I appreciate that, Miss Flores. The letters you sent were helpful, but they left much unexplained." They spent the rest of the day showing Catherine around the ranch, explaining the circumstances of Mary's arrival and the gradual deterioration of her situation. David was unflinchingly honest about his methods, his motivations, and his failures. Catherine listened without interruption, her face a mask of controlled emotion. The most difficult moment came when they visited Mary's grave, now marked with the elegant granite headstone they had commissioned. Catherine knelt beside the marker, tracing her sister's name with trembling fingers. "She was always the brave one," Catherine said quietly. "Even as a child, she would stand up to bullies twice her size, defend anyone she thought was being treated unfairly. I should have known she wouldn't submit quietly to what you were doing to her." "She fought," David said. "Right until the end, she fought to maintain her dignity and her autonomy. I was too selfish to see that as strength rather than defiance." Catherine stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Tell me about the night she died, everything you remember." David recounted the events of Mary's final evening, her confrontation with him about the drugs, her desperate flight into the storm, his pursuit in the discovery of her body. His voice broke several times during the telling, but he pushed through to the end. "I convinced myself I was trying to save her," he concluded. "But the truth is, I was trying to save myself from the loneliness of losing another woman. Mary died because I couldn't bear to let her make her own choices." Catherine was quiet for a long time, staring out over the landscape that had claimed her sister's life. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but heavy with grief. "Mary wrote to me about the beauty of this place, about the mountains and the wide sky. She said it felt like freedom after the crowded streets of Boston. I think she would have been happy here if you had given her the chance." The words hit David like physical blows, and Sarah saw him flinch with the pain of them. But Catherine wasn't finished. "I also think she would want me to understand why Miss Flores has chosen to stay with you. Mary always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption even for those who had done terrible things." Sarah felt the weight of Catherine's gaze settle on her. "Why did you stay, Miss Flores? After learning what he had done to my sister and the others? Why didn't you run?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading, but also the one she had prepared for most carefully. Because running wouldn't have changed what happened to Mary or Elena or Rebecca. It wouldn't have ensured that their stories were told honestly or that their families received the truth about their deaths. "And you believe he's capable of change?" "I believe he's trying to change. Whether he'll succeed is something we'll learn over time." Catherine nodded slowly. "And your relationship with him? Are you his wife now?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm his partner in the work of making amends for what he did. We share a house and a commitment to honoring the dead, but nothing more intimate than that." By choice? By choice, mine. That evening, they sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal that Sarah had prepared from vegetables grown in her own garden. The conversation was less strained than it had been during the day, though the weight of Mary's presence seemed to fill the empty chair at the table. What will happen to this place? And Catherine asked. Will you continue living here together, maintaining this unusual arrangement? Sarah and David exchanged glances, a conversation passing between them without words. They had discussed this question many times over the past months, but had never reached a definitive answer. That depends on many things, David said. On whether Sarah continues to believe in the possibility of redemption, on whether I can prove myself worthy of the second chance she's given me, on whether the work we're doing here continues to feel meaningful, and on whether other families like yours can find some peace in knowing the truth about what happened to their loved ones, Sarah added. Catherine studied them both, seeing something in their relationship that seemed to satisfy her. Mary always said that the worst thing about dying young would be being forgotten, having her story reduced to a few lines in a church registry. You've given her more than that. You've given her a place in a larger story about redemption and second chances. Is that enough? David asked. Can that begin to make up for what I took from her? From all of them? Nothing can make up for taking a life, Catherine said bluntly. But the fact that you're asking the question, that you're willing to spend your life trying to answer it, that means something. They talked long into the night, sharing stories about Mary's childhood, her dreams for the future, her letters home during her brief time at the ranch. Catherine had brought photographs and mementos that helped flesh out the picture of who Mary had been before she became one of David's victims. As the evening wound down, Catherine turned to Sarah with one final question. Do you ever regret staying? Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you had made a different choice? Sarah considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that 3 women had to die before David learned to see women as human beings rather than possessions. But I don't regret the choice itself. The work we're doing here, the letters we're writing, the way we're trying to honor the dead, it feels important. It feels like something worth doing. And if he disappoints you, if he proves incapable of the change you're hoping for, then I'll leave and the story will end differently. But I'll still have done what I could to ensure that Mary and Elena and Rebecca weren't forgotten. Catherine nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. Mary would have liked you, I think. She always admired women who were willing to take risks for principles they believed in. The next morning, Catherine prepared to leave, her visit having accomplished what she had come for. She had seen where her sister died, had heard the truth about her final days, and had met the people who were trying to build something meaningful from the tragedy of her death. As the wagon pulled away, Sarah and David stood together on the porch, watching until it disappeared over the ridge. The visit had been emotionally exhausting for both of them, but it had also felt necessary, a crucial step in their ongoing work of making amends. Do you think she forgives me? David asked. I think she understands you, Sarah replied, which might be more important than forgiveness. They returned to their daily routines, but something had shifted between them during Catherine's visit. The presence of Mary's sister had forced them to articulate their relationship more clearly, to define what they were trying to build together. That evening, as they worked in the garden together, Sarah found herself thinking about the future with more optimism than she had felt in months. The work they were doing felt meaningful, their partnership felt sustainable, and she was beginning to believe that redemption might actually be possible, even for someone who had done terrible things. Sarah, David said as they finished harvesting the last of the summer squash, I want you to know that whatever happens between us, whatever our relationship becomes or doesn't become, I'm grateful for the chance you've given me, the chance to try to become better than I was. Sarah looked at him, seeing the man who had drugged her and manipulated her, but also the man who was working every day to make amends for his past actions. The complexity of it no longer frustrated her as much as it once had. People were complex, capable of both great harm and great good, sometimes within the same lifetime. We're both different than we were when I first arrived here, she said. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what redemption looks like. Not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual becoming of something better than what we were. As the sun set over the Montana landscape, Sarah Flores stood in her garden, surrounded by the abundance she had grown with her own hands. She had survived everything David James could do to her, had turned his methods against his enemies, had forged a partnership based on truth rather than deception. She had eaten everything life had offered her, the bitter along with the sweet, and had found ways to transform even the most difficult experiences into something she could live with. Her grandmother had been right about survival, about the strength that came from being able to consume whatever circumstances demanded. But Sarah had learned something else as well, something Abuela might not have anticipated. Sometimes survival wasn't just about eating everything put before you. Sometimes it was about choosing what to swallow and what to spit out, what to digest and what to transform, what to keep and what to let go. She had made her choices, and she was living with the consequences. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she first answered that advertisement in the newspaper, but it was a life she had built with her own hands, shaped by her own decisions, sustained by her own strength. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, that felt like enough.